All right, I think we're live. All right, so we are live here. So welcome to the fourth, I guess I should have counted, fourth weekly quick bites from the UMKC Political Science Department. So this week, what we're going to be talking about is political animosity and cognitive biases with Dr. Elizabeth Vonnahme. I'm Dr. Benjamin Woodson. Um, who will be asking the questions, and she'll be providing her expertise on these subjects. So let's get in there and see if we can make this quick bite actually quick. All right, so we live in very, very polarized political times. You know, both sides of the political spectrum have very intense negative feelings about their political opponents. And so while, you know, politics has always been negative and politicians have always vilified and attacked each other. So, for example, Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton over him basically saying very mean things about him during a political campaign. So there's negativity in politics. But it really does sort of feel like today's negativity is sort of greater than it has at least in the relatively recently past. So is there evidence, I guess, for an increase in partisan animosity recently, or is this just sort of how politics always feels, or is this weird?
So it is weird, and it is the case that there's been animosity from the very beginning, right? The Republic is formed out of a revolution, which is in and of itself full of conflict, but it has become more conflictual, more negative over time, and there's quite a lot of evidence for that. So one piece of evidence that I love is survey researchers asked people in 1960, would you be displeased if your children married X? And that X was things like racial and ethnic groups, different racial and ethnic groups, different religious groups. But they also asked about party. So would you be displeased if your child married somebody of another party? And in 1960, the percent that indicated displeasure was about 5%. Fast forward to 2010, that number jumps to 40%. And that's where I think we see sort of this change over time, is that the political animosity that we've had in this country for years is spilling over into our social world as well. And that's where I think things get more problematic over time.
Okay, well that does sound like it's a bit worse these days, maybe. So what can sort of psychology research that you've done or studied or taught about in class help to provide for sort of an explanation for this increase in effective polarization we've
Yeah, so there's a lot of explanations for why animosity has increased lately. And I think to pretend that they're all cognitive or all psychological is certainly not true. But so the increase in money in politics, the movement of elites to the left and the right over time has certainly contributed to it. Probably the biggest external force, I would say, is the changing media environment. So having the creation of the cable news networks, the expansion of the internet, and certainly the emergence of social media have all contributed to this intense animosity. But I feel, and that's my job as a political psychologist, to believe that a lot of, sort of our political world is also driven by what's going on in our brains. And so I'll just talk about two of these cognitive biases, but there's lots of biases or tendencies that we have as humans to engage in certain kinds of thinking and behavior that can contribute to things like political animosity. So one of them that I think is pretty well understood within the political psychology community, but even at large, maybe the community, is also the negativity bias. So the negativity bias is this idea that individuals have a tendency to pay more attention to negative information than positive information, and they also give that negative information more weight. And so let me give you a non-political example, and then I'll give you the political one. So you're driving down the highway, which nobody's doing right now, but imagine you're driving down the highway and there's a car crash on the side of the road. It's far removed from you, but you can't stop but look at it, right? And so instead of paying attention to what you're doing, which is driving on the highway, and you should be watching the cars around you, you're instead looking off to the right at this car crash. And that's essentially the negativity bias. We pay more attention to that negative, very negative information in this case, than the positive or neutral information around us. And in the political world, we see that especially problematic during campaigns, where not just voters, but the news media pays substantial attention to things, gaffes, when candidates misspeak, or all these old videos get resurrected of the past where candidates are saying really abhorrent in many cases, and other cases just really embarrassing things. And we focus in on that instead of focusing as much attention on their policy plans and what they actually can and want to do if they were elected. So that negativity bias means that we're more inclined to pay attention to bad things, especially about the opposition. And that, coupled with a second bias, which is called motivated reasoning, I think creates this animosity to a large extent. So motivated reasoning is this idea that individuals, once they form an impression of somebody, they're really motivated to maintain that impression. And so if you feel positive about somebody, the way you interpret incoming information, the way you view the world, or the information about that person is colored by that first impression. And so again, let me give you a non-political example. And this one is going to require even more imagination because of our current stay-at-home order. But imagine you're in a bar. Please don't go to a bar. I don't want you to imagine this, but if you're in a bar and you look over sort of at the bar and you see your best friend's husband, and he's sitting there with this really attractive woman, and how you feel about your best friend's husband is going to dictate how you interpret that incoming information. So if you really like him, you're like, oh, that very attractive woman must be his, long lost cousin, or probably his sister, maybe a really good coworker. But if you don't like him, then what you immediately go to is this idea, is of course the number one thing that pops in your head, which is, oh my God, he's cheating on my friend. And that, if you don't like the person, that just feeds into that negativity, like, oh, I knew he was a scumbag, here's even more evidence, and so forth. So you call your friend, let her know. But that's essentially what motivated reasoning is all about. It's that when we are presented with the same information, depending on our prior impressions, we may interpret that information in very different ways. So in a political context, I think this isn't going to stretch anyone's imagination. Donald Trump is loved by quite a few people in this country, and he's hated by just as equal a number of people in this country. And so when new information about Donald Trump or about his policies or his plans for dealing with the pandemic, for example, are released, people interpret that information very differently based on how they feel about him. So people who hate him say, everything he does is terrible. People who love him, everything he does is wonderful. And it's driven by that motivated reasoning. So I think biases like these help contribute to that animosity that we see. They're not alone, right? All that, the money in politics, the changing media environment, all those things contribute. But I do think we have a little bit to blame for the situation we find ourselves in.
All right. Well, it sounds like our minds sort of how our psychology works kind of pushes us sometimes into these two, opposing sides, and makes us really sort of reemphasizes sort of our divide, I guess, in some ways. And sort of makes us despise our political opponents, cast them as villains, these sorts of things. Is there actually a way to break out of this cycle? Like, is there something that psychology says can help us to reduce this motivated reasoning or that negativity bias that you talked about?
Sure. I think there are some things that could be done, and we can talk about the reality, sort of the likelihood of that, but let's suspend reality for a few minutes. But yeah, I do think there are things, and it's not all driven by, sort of these psychological biases. So I do think one thing, just being aware of these biases is a good thing, because it makes you pause at the very least before engaging in some of this sort of biased thinking. But I think some other things that people can do is, especially politicians and elites, is to stop framing every political debate in moral terms. So the minute you start saying, well, if you believe X, you're immoral, you've lost the other side entirely, right? Nobody's going to listen to you if you've just told them they're an immoral person. And so I think if we save the moral language for the really critical and really moral issues, I think that would help a lot, because it keeps people at the table. And sort of coupled with that, then I think is a need to control rhetoric. And I know that's funny coming from me. I'm not exactly known for controlling my rhetoric, but I do think it's really important when we're talking about sort of political elites especially, and when we're in the midst of campaigns, is not to go overboard, right? No one's the devil, right? No one is calling somebody Hitler doesn't help, right? None of those things are useful if what we're trying to do is create an environment where we're trying to come up with good policy ideas. Because the minute you label somebody Hitler, you've lost them, right? And you've lost their team, you've lost their supporters. And so I think that can help quite a bit. But I think there is a job for you and I, Vin, and our sort of fellow educators out there, especially at the sort of secondary education level, which is to teach compromise. I think one thing we don't do very well is teach students that compromise is critical to a functioning democracy. And it's interesting and ironic that we don't teach it, because this is how we live our everyday lives as adults, right? Every decision you make is as a result of a compromise, whether it's where are we going to eat tonight, right? What movie are we going to watch? Unless you live in a really terrible relationship, you have to compromise sometimes, right? And yet when it comes to politics, we don't apply that same sort of what I think of as adult logic to the situation. I think if we teach people that compromise is not selling out, that compromise is really about trying to produce the best outcome for the most individuals, then I think that might help a bit. So I said all these things are possible, and we can talk about.
Yeah, well, one of the things you said made me think of sort of one of my weird pet peeves in politics, which I know will never go away. But like when politicians like, we have to fight to do this and fight to do this, and I'm like, no, you just have to get more votes. That's it.
Right. Right.
I don't consider like calling people on the phone and knocking on their door fighting, but I understand sort of why they do it, but it's just sort of like, no, that's not fighting. You just need to get more votes.
Well, yeah, no, and I think that's probably one of the best examples of sort of the need to control the rhetoric, because starting really in the 1980s, we started to see more of this war rhetoric coming into campaigning. And so we're fighting a war for the soul of America. This is a battle, for the future of America. That language helps create this animosity, and it really triggers people or primes people to think in those kinds of, good team, bad team, my side, your side. And I think that's a shame. I think that's a problem for, because it's not just, maybe elites don't really believe any of that language they're using, but when that filters down, it certainly becomes believable, and it affects people's attitudes towards politics.
Yeah. So like the 1980s, that's sort of when our polarization started. Sort of just gotten kind of, the initial bit of polarization we have now. I mean, the current bit of polarization we have now sort of started then. And so you're saying sort of that some of that, you can see that in the rhetoric. Do you think we've already sort of mentioned this a little bit, but we'll sort of end with this, I guess. So does the current political rhetoric we have now, or the current political environment, exacerbate these problems that sort of exacerbate motivated reasoning in some way, maybe exacerbate that negativity bias more so than even like back in the 1980s when, you were fighting for the soul of America and these sorts of things?
I think it does. I mean, and I think, I hate to always blame social media for everything, but I do think it's not just social media, but the media environment we live in enables us to engage in, a source selection that contributes to this sort of, so one of the things contributes to this animosity. One of the things that researchers have documented with regard to motivated reasoning, it's not just about our interpretation of incoming information differs based on our prior impressions, but our seeking out of new information is also driven by that. So if I already hate Donald Trump, I'm not likely to to go to sources that I know might say good things about him, right? So I'm not going to go to his Twitter account. I'm not going to go to certain more conservative sources who might be applauding the president for certain things. And that kind of searching, that kind of source selection then continues to feed into this, because then the information I see is straightly in line with my prior impression. I'm interpreting it along those lines. And we get into this sort of vicious cycle where, we start to see this divide, and it just continues over time.
All right. Well, we do have one question from someone on Facebook Live, so I'll ask you that. So this involves masks. So he's asking about how masks have become part of this culture war, it appears. So do you?
I'm sorry. What?
The wearing of the masks. So,
Oh, like for COVID.
Face masks. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I was
the
like, what masks?
The
Okay.
coronavirus. It's that thing that's going around now.
Right.
That's
That whole
causing some
virus thing.
problems.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So that the masks have become part of the culture war, it seems. So do you think motivated reasoning has applied in those sorts of circumstances in some way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, so we've been talking in sort of this politician sense that our attitudes towards politicians are driven by these tendencies. But it doesn't just have to be about politicians. It's motivated reasoning. This negativity bias can contribute to the way we understand people's attitudes towards policies. So things like stay-at-home orders, mask orders, right? Orders to require people to wear masks. All of that can certainly be driven by these biases we have. And yeah, it would not surprise me that when everything does open back up, if we don't see some pretty clear differences in terms of who's in terms of who's actually complying with some of these orders based on prior attitudes, and not just partisanship, but I think ideology will help predict it, partisanship, the way people feel about the leaders of their state and their city, and whether those leaders correspond to their partisanship. I think that's going to have a pretty substantial effect on whether people really abide by these orders.
All right. Well, that was the final Facebook question, and I believe we have kept this quick bite.
Quick.
So unless you have anything else to add, we will end it there.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
All right. I'm glad we solved partisan animosity.
Right.
All right. Bye. Bye, everybody. See you next.